thank you very much for the generous invitation. And thanks for coming. It's nice to be here. Gorgeous building, gorgeous campus, wonderful space, lots of light. Okay, so the world that we encounter, at least in Berkeley, this is what it's like. It's dynamic, it's cluttered, it's crowded, it's crazy, it's complex. And this presents three major challenges for the visual system. These three challenges start with selection. If we want to recognize objects in the scene, what they are, whether to be aware of them, whether to be cognizant of them, if we want to pick them up for a ride, for example, we need to select objects. Selection isn't just about getting our attention on that object and recognizing that object. Attention, a lot of what attention has to do is filter out the irrelevant stuff, get rid of those distractors. And since natural scenes are constantly cluttered, we have to spend a lot of attentional energy filtering distractors. So the first problem that the visual system faces is one of selection, specifically filtering distractors. The second problem, that's a major problem for the visual system, is prediction. Objects are constantly moving. It's not just that they are moving, we are moving. Our eyes are constantly moving, or we are moving relative to the world. So objects moving across the retina is a serious problem for the visual system because the visual processing is sluggish. And that means that what we perceive at any one moment lags behind reality. We perceive something here, but in the world, the object is physically moved ahead. So the visual system needs to do some sort of compensation or prediction of where objects are in the world at any given moment. The third problem that the visual system faces is one of stabilization. We want to perceive objects as having a constant identity. We don't want to confuse them with other objects in scenes. We want to perceive this object despite the fact that it's moving around the scene or we are moving around the scene. We want to perceive that object as having one stable identity with no confusion. So these are three of the major problems that visual system faces in these kinds of naturally dynamic and cluttered scenes. And these are the problems that my lab has been interested in over the last few years and what I want to talk to you about today. The first problem, selection. I want to focus on something that isn't usually talked about, which is how we deal with distractors, how we deal with the clutter in the world, not the object of interest, but everything else around it. And the specific hypothesis that I want to address is one that's been around for a while. The hypothesis is that the pulvinar nucleus in the back of the thalamus right here, this is the pulvinar, it's bilateral structure, occupies the back of the thalamus, plays a role in filtering distractors. And the reason that this came up as a hypothesis is because of a couple of characteristics of the pulvinar. It's really large. In humans, relative to the cortex, it's larger than in virtually any other species. And it's massively and reciprocally connected with virtually every other cortical area in the brain, especially every visual area in the brain. And this massive connectivity and the size of it made a lot of people suggest that this could play a role in mediating attentional effects and perhaps specifically in filtering distractors. This hypothesis has been partially addressed in patient studies, but not really directly. And so we wanted to directly address this using fMRI. And the person who did this really is Jason Fisher. Jason was a graduate student in my lab who's now moved on to a job at Johns Hopkins. And what Jason did when he was in my lab was do an fMRI experiment looking at patterns of activity. He used a multivariate pattern analysis technique that we developed many years ago in my lab to look at patterns of activity in the pulvinar and specifically how much information the pulvinar carries. So we're not interested in raw bold response or raw brain activity, raw amplitudes. What we're interested in is how much information is contained in the pulvinar and how selective that information is for a particular stimulus. And Jason, in a previous paper, defined the pulvinar, and that's what I'm showing you here is just a region of interest defining the pulvinar. And we did that in a previous paper, and now in this study that I'm telling you about, he's using a multivariate pattern analysis in the pulvinar. And what we did was a very straightforward psychophysical experiment that we then took into the magnet. The experiment was very straightforward. There were 4 Gabor patches presented on the screen, and they flickered in counterphase at about 8 hertz, so they're very salient. The subject fixates here at the center all the time, and in each run of this experiment, the subject's instructed to either attend to the upper pair of Gabors, the upper visual field, or to the lower pair of Gabors, the lower visual field. And the pair of Gabors in a lower visual field here could be located in each trial at one of 5 eccentricities ranging from about 8.5 to about 9.5 degrees eccentricity. So This is very closely spaced. 8.5 to 9.5 degrees is basically about a degree of difference between these Gabor locations. So they were always in pretty similar location. Variation was very small. In this particular trial, the Gabors are located at eccentricity 3. The upper pair of Gabors, in this case these are the ignored Gabors, could also be located at one of 5 eccentricities, ranging from the same 8.5 to 9.5 degrees. The key is that the pair of Gabors that are ignored are in a position that's independently assigned relative to the pair of Gabors that's attended. So in this particular trial, the ignored Gabors are at position 2, and the attended Gabors are at position 3. So this trial I'll just set aside right here. I'll show you that as trials progressed, the Gabors were assigned independent random locations on each trial. And so we have a series or a sequence of ignored Gabor locations, and we have a sequence of attended Gabor locations. And this 2 sequences gives us 2 ways of analyzing the data. We can either analyze the data according to the ignored Gabor locations or according to the attended Gabor locations. And so that's what Jason did. Jason created a general linear model and defined predictors according to the ignored Gabor locations, and then fit that GLM to the data in the pulvinar. This is the pulvinar bilateral, the full pulvinar ROI, so you use the entire region of interest. And then contrasted each of those predictors against the fixation baseline to generate 5 separate maps of activity. So each one of these volumetric maps of activity corresponds to one of the Gabor eccentricities. This volumetric map corresponds to the Gabors that are closest to the fovea. This volumetric map corresponds to Gabors that are furthest from the fovea. Now, since there's another sequence of Gabors, the attended Gabors, Jason can define a GLM, use these as predictors, fit that model to the data in the pulvinar, and generate 5 more maps of activity. Each one of these volumetric maps corresponds to each of the attended Gabor eccentricities. So these are the attended Gabors at eccentricity 1, and these are the volumetric map corresponding to the attended Gabors at eccentricity 5. So it's worth pointing out that in both of these cases, we have these five volumetric maps and these 5 volumetric maps. The data is the same. It's the same region of interest, the same time courses, the same voxels. Everything is absolutely identical. Even the stimuli were the same. The attended and the ignored Gabors are on the screen at the same time. It's the same runs, the same functional runs. There's only one difference between this. It's the way that we're modeling the data. We're either modeling the data according to the ignored Gabor locations, or we model the data according to the attended Gabor location. And the question we're asking is very simple. We're simply asking, is there a systematic change in the pattern of activity here as we shift the location of the ignored Gabors? So the ignored Gabors are just that, ignored, and they change location systematically. Is there a corresponding systematic change in the pattern of activity? Same thing for the attended Gabors. As the attended Gabors change location from position 1 to position 5, is there a systematic change in the pattern of activity? So that's all we're asking. The way to measure that, we simply used a cross-correlation approach. So we can take any pair of volumetric maps. This is a volumetric map corresponding to the attended Gabors at location 2 versus location 3. The Gabors are located in very similar positions, they're overlapping. So not surprisingly, they generate very similar patterns of activity. And that's what I'm showing you here on this plot. So it's the activity for every voxel. Every blue dot is one voxel. The activity for every voxel for the Gabors at position 3 versus the activity corresponding to the Gabors in position 2. High correlation because the objects are in very similar positions, they overlap. This is not surprising. You can plot this Fisher Z-score over here on this graph, and you can see this is the separation between the Gabor patches. Very closely separated, so they're overlapping, and there's a very high degree of similarity in the pattern of activity. Now, if we take a different pair of Gabor patches with a different pair of volumetric maps for those Gabor patches, we see that there is a reduced correlation. So these are more separated. The Gabor patches are more separated, the volumetric maps are more different, and so the correlation is lower. And that correlation, if we plot on this graph over here, what we see is a trend. This trend, this downward trend, is a kind of position tuning, and that's what we're after. We're after a position selectivity. This is a tuning function. In this case, it's tuning for object location. It could have been for orientation or color or something else. In this case, it's for object location. And this kind of pattern would indicate that the region of interest has tuning for object position. If there were no tuning, we'd get a flat line. So this is the pattern that we're looking for, and that's what Jason did. Fisher did this across the entire pulvinar region of interest in this paper a couple of years ago. And across the entire pulvinar region of interest, he found that there is significant tuning for the attended object location. So that is, if we take the attended Gabor patches and we shift them in location ever so slightly from 1/3 of a degree to about 1/2 a degree visual angle difference, there's an increasing dissimilarity in the pattern of activity. The pattern of activity across the pulvinar ROI becomes more dissimilar. All right, so there's tuning for attended object location. Now what's more interesting is if we look at what happens for the ignored objects, the ignored Gabors. They're on the screen at the same time. Is there any tuning for ignored object location? And that's what I'm showing you over here. As the ignored Gabors are shifted in position, there's no change in the similarity of the pattern of activity. So there's no tuning for object position if those objects are ignored. When those same objects at that same location were attended, there is tuning. So this is not about upper visual field versus lower. Remember, the upper visual field could be attended or it could be ignored. It also is a floor effect. Notice the correlation here is about 0.75. That's a really high correlation. Floor is way down here. It's actually off the graph. It's not 0, but it's not on this graph. This is way above floor, so this is not noise. It's not a floor effect. It's not lack of information. There's actually significant responses and significant similarity in the responses to the ignored objects. There's simply no tuning for object position when that object is ignored. Make that object the attended object, and then there's tuning. So what's special about the pulvinar are these ignored objects and how the selectivity disappears for them. When we take a subtraction or difference between these, we get a what we call, or we're just calling this in the paper, a distracted gating index, because the pulvinar is effectively gating from something very strong to 0, all the way down to 0. So we call this a gating index, or an attention gating effect, and it's significant across the entire pulvinar. This is looking at the whole pulvinar as a whole. That's a conservative way to do it because it's including all kinds of oxygens that probably have nothing to do with it, so it's adding a bunch of noise in. A more sensitive way to do this, and what Jason did, was do a roving spotlight across the entire image volume, so across the entire brain. Take large ROIs, the size of the pulvinar, and then do that same analysis across the entire brain in a roving spotlight. And what I'm showing you here are the regions in the brain that show the strongest distractor gating index. And what you see is some of the regions are in the pulvinar. In fact, most of the regions that do this distractor gating are found in the pulvinar. What I'm not suggesting is that attention happens in the pulvinar and not elsewhere. Of course, there are attention effects anywhere you look, from V1 to parietal areas, frontal areas, anywhere you look, you'll find attention effects. What's unique about the pulvinar is that it goes from being selective to an object to being 0. No, not selective in any way. Whereas if you look in other areas of the brain, for example, early visual areas, or parietal areas, you will find selectivity. And I'll give you an example of that. Here's what's special about the pulvinar. This is the discrimination of the ignored object position. In other words, the flat tuning function I showed you. There's no tuning for ignored object position in the pulvinar. If we look at V1, primary visual cortex, is strongly tuned to the ignored objects. V1 does not care whether you attend or ignore an object. If it's an 8 Hz flickering, 100% contrast object, V1 is going to encode the position quite well. And the same goes for V2, V3, all of the other occipital areas, and the same holds for parietal areas as well. These areas will still encode the position of an ignored object very well. Pulvinar is special in this respect. An ignored object goes from being well-tuned to 0. And that's what's really unique about the pulvinar compared to all of the other areas, basically in the brain. So this is a hint. It's not the full story yet, but it's a hint that that selection is not just about getting our attention on this object, amplifying the response to that object. It's also about dealing with the distractors. And the pulvinar may provide one of the mechanisms, if not the mechanism, for filtering or helping to filter distractor-related information. And later on, if you have questions, I can talk to you about the connectivity between pulvinar and primary visual cortex and how that might happen, how the filtering might happen. Okay, so we have a first hint that one of these 3 major challenges that face the visual system might be helped by a subcortical route, the pulvinar. That isn't enough. Even if we've isolated the object, filtered out the distractors, and we've got our attention on that object, we still have to deal with the fact that seeing is dynamic, and we have to predict where this object is going, or where it is at this moment even. The delays in visual processing are at least 100 milliseconds, and that means a car like this or a baseball could be 15 feet behind its actual location. You know, where an object is perceived is 15 feet behind its physical location. All right, so how does the visual system deal with this? So this is a question we've been after in my lab for over a decade. We've been really interested in prediction in the case of a moving object. So if you fixate here, I'll give you an example of the kind of prediction that the visual system is doing, that your visual system is doing. Notice the two flashes at the top of the screen here, and they're physically aligned, but most people perceive the flash on the right as being below the flash on the left. If you're still fixating that bullseye, you'll notice the two flashes on the bottom. The flash on the right appears above the flash on the left. So does everybody see this misalignment? Now they're physically aligned. There's no misalignment in the display. If I put these red outlines here, you can see that the flashes are perfectly lined up, and yet if I remove that reference frame, they look misaligned. And this is motion dragging the position, the apparent position of a static object along with it. Motion of a background captures objects in a predictive way, and this is the kind of mechanism the visual system could use to compensate for neural delays, helping make a perception of typically dynamic scenes or dynamic objects more accurate in virtue of compensating for the position error, the lag position error. All right, so we've studied this a lot psychophysically. We've done tons of many papers on this psychophysically, but what I wanted to talk about today was a couple of specific things. One was a TMS experiment we did years ago, where you can see an invisible brain here. There's an invisible brain, trust me there. A TMS, we use brain site navigated TMS to deliver 10 hertz high frequency TMS to area MT, the motion area. Most of you know that MT, or V5, is a motion selective area in the human brain, bilateral, and it seems to be very important in processing motion of backgrounds, motion of scenes, and if we lack that area, for example, we have motion blindness or kinetopsia. So this seems to be an important area for motion processing. What we were interested in this experiment is if we deliver TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a brief, powerful magnetic pulse, disrupt the motion area, MT, temporarily, could we influence a subject's perception of an object's location? Not its motion, but its location. When we're trying to localize the tennis ball, get a racket on it, does this area MT, the invisible area here, does it contribute to our ability to perceive the tennis ball's location? Okay, so Garrett Mouse did a version of this. I did a version of this years ago, and what we found is that when we stimulated MT with TMS, that illusion that you just saw was reduced, and it was noticeably reduced. I mean, it wasn't just measurable in the data, you could actually see a reduction in the illusion. More recently, Garrett Mouse, who's a postdoc in my lab, has been studying this, and one of the things that he was interested in following that on that TMS result was the possibility that MT, area MT, could play a role not just in motion processing, but also in position assignment. If that's true, if that TMS result is true, then it would predict that MT, or patterns of activity in MT, should represent object locations, like these flashes, and not just full field motion, not just optic flow, not just generalized motion, but actually the specific locations of individual objects in visual field. So this would be a novel idea, because MT is not treated as an area that codes for object locations. So what Garrett did was present a stimulus like this, an illusion like this, that was completely balanced physically, and he measured the pattern responses, multivariate pattern analysis, to these flashes, depending on the direction of motion in the background. And what he found was the representation of that static object depends on the direction of motion in the background, and significantly so. So not only does MT represent static object positions, but it does so in a motion-dependent way, such that an object that's represented in MT has a shifted representation if there's background motion. And this is the direction that you'd expect if the visual system, specifically area MT, is trying to make a prediction about where that flashed object ought to be in the world. Okay, so there's some evidence now that MT, this motion area MT, not only plays a role in position assignment, but also does so for in a dynamically dependent way. All right, so that was a very brief overview of that whole research program, but it gives you an idea that prediction is something that that area MT could be participating in, and it's one of the things that we're really interested in. The real focus of this talk, what I wanted to talk to you most about today, was the third section, which is once we've isolated an object, selectively attended to it, filtered out the distractors, and we've made some prediction about where it's located, we have an even bigger challenge, which is in the recognition of that object. We have its identity, but we want to perceive that identity as being stable and continuous. We don't want to perceive fluctuations in identity. Now imagine we're moving around a scene, objects are moving around scenes, the lighting changes, there's noise, there's camouflage, and that means that what could happen is we could perceive uncertainty in the identity of that object over time. It might appear to fluctuate. So we're driving down a scene, actually this is a familiar scene, this is right up the hill from where you are. This is winter in Sierra. This is when you're not supposed to be driving on the road. But in the name of science, I needed a video, so I went up there. Actually, I happened to be up there, and I'm not from around here, so I didn't realize that this is not a smart thing to do. So you're driving up the road, and no chains on your tires. So there's plenty of snow. There's plenty of windshield wipers. There are lots of occlusions. There's lots of discontinuities. There's lots of noise. The noise can be external, like the snow, or like the discontinuities of windshield wipers. It can be due to internal noise, sources of noise. There's also changes. The size of these trees change as we move. We change viewpoint as we move around them. There are all kinds of sources of camouflage, and yet the object that we're looking at appears to be the same object. This appears to be the same tree continuously. It doesn't have to be. The image changes on our retina are enormous. Why don't we perceive any fluctuation in the identity of this object? Well, one answer to this, we thought, might be in the fact that the world is autocorrelated. So objects that are present at this moment tended to be present in previous moments. So the question is, how does the visual system promote this stable and continuous perception of an object? How does the visual system help us perceive object identities or people's identities as being stable? And the two students who are working on this are Jason Fisher, I mentioned before, who left the lab and stayed in a job. Alina Lieberman is a graduate student currently in the lab, and this is her research program. And she's been working on this hard for the last couple of years. And the key, we think, is that the world is autocorrelated. And if the world is autocorrelated, why doesn't the visual system just take advantage of this? And so it's a very simple question. Can we find serial dependence in perception? What we perceived a second ago is probably still there. Why not just perceive perceive at this moment what we perceived a few seconds ago? And so this is the question that we're going to try to answer. And we did it with a really simple experiment, one that you can't see, but I will describe it for you. You can trust me, maybe. There's a dot here that subjects fixate, a bullseye. There's a Gabor patch over here. And the Gabor patch has an orientation. This is very close to, this is very high contrast, trust me, in the experiment. It's very high contrast. It's super threshold. Subjects have no problem detecting or recognizing this. It's not a noisy thing. It's not a low contrast thing. It's something like 90% contrast. Okay, so subjects see this oriented Gabor patch. Has totally random orientation. All they have to do is a very, very simple task, which is match the orientation of that Gabor patch. They see a bit of noise as a mask to make sure they get rid of any negative after effect, and then they're presented with this white bar. This white bar is an adjustment bar, and they can rotate it anywhere they want. It's a random orientation initially, and then they rotate it to match the orientation of the Gabor that they just saw. So it could not be a simpler task. All right, so here's another trial. Subjects fixating, they see a Gabor patch. This one's tilted this direction now. It's 500 milliseconds, super threshold. Noise mask comes up to get rid of any negative after effect, and then the white bar appears, and subject matches the orientation they just saw. On average, it took subjects about a second to make this adjustment, but it varied somewhat because it's up to them. They could take as long as they wanted. Okay, so the subjects are pretty good at this, and then there's a 2-second intertrial interval, and then another random Gabor patch. The orientation on every trial is totally random, totally independent, totally uniform, and no statistical structure to it. All right, so here's the current trial. This is a Gabor patch tilted like this, anti-clockwise. What I'm showing you here is some data, and the y-axis is the error in the subject's ability to match this orientation. So a perfectly accurate subject would have all of their data points sitting right at zero error. You might imagine that subjects are pretty good at this. They are pretty good at this, and so they might, but they might have a bit of error, so they should be normally distributed around 0, like this. In fact, what we did was plot their errors relative to the previous trial orientation. So here's the previous trial. And what you can hopefully see is that the Gabor orientation is slightly more clockwise relative to the current trial. Slightly more clockwise. Okay, so that's what these positive numbers over here mean. When the previous trial was more clockwise, that's what we're going to plot over here. When the previous trial was more counterclockwise, we're going to plot that data over here. Now the data should have been normally distributed around 0, but it wasn't. The error distribution was strongly biased in this interesting S-curve kind of shape, such that when the previous orientation was more clockwise, the errors that subjects made were also more clockwise. When the previous orientation, this guy right here, was more anti-clockwise, which would be over here, the errors also tended to be more anti-clockwise. Subjects are making errors consistent with the previous stimulus, the stimulus that was present 5 or so seconds ago. All right, so we can characterize this. This is an attraction, I should point out. An attraction of the currently assigned Gabor orientation, the perceived orientation on the current Gabor, is pulled toward the previous one. So it's an attractive effect. This is not a negative after effect. It's not the tilt after effect. A tilt after effect, a negative after effect would produce this shape, which is exactly opposite of what we find. So it's not a negative after effect. In fact, it's a positive after effect, if anything. And we can characterize this by simply fitting a derivative Gaussian to try to characterize the amplitude of this effect. And the amplitude, or half the amplitude in this case, is 10 degrees. So in other words, the full amplitude is 20 degrees. This is a huge, huge effect. If you look at the slope right there around 0, the slope is 100%. That means if two Gabors are separated by 10 degrees, it's a wild difference, easily discriminable. 10 degrees separation in the orientation of these two Gabors, they look identical. A 10-degree Gabor that's 10 degrees off from the previous trial captures the current Gabor's orientation, the full 10 degrees. So people are assigning physically different objects as appearing identical. So this is a really, really strong effect. This is for one subject, and this is for the previous trial. This is the one-back effect. We can also look at the two-back effect. Here's 4 subjects worth of data across all 4 subjects, and then many more since then, since this paper was published, show a really strong effect. This is a half amplitude, so 8 degrees is just a half amplitude. So it's many JNDs. This is the two-back effect. So this is 2 Gabors ago. This is about 10 seconds ago. It takes a few seconds for each trial to play itself out. So this is about 10 seconds ago. There's still a significant serial dependence. Even 3 trials ago, we're talking about 15 seconds ago. It's small, but it's still measurable and significant. So the serial dependence of perceived orientation goes at least 15 seconds back, 3 independent trials. And we know it's not a knock-on effect. It's not just a one-back effect that's masquerading as a 2 or 3-back effect. We can control that with simulations, which I can tell you about later. So there's this really strong serial dependence in orientation perception. The perceived orientation of an object now depends on what you saw in previous 15 seconds or more. Does it require some explicit memory? This is what everybody asks. Everybody thinks of this. Maybe subjects are remembering the orientation, and maybe it's the false memory, or maybe it's just their explicit memory of the Gabor orientation. That's what's pulling them. So we did another experiment. What Jason did, Fisher did was 2 tasks. In one, he had subjects do exactly what I described before, which is match the orientation that the subject just saw. But they also were given a second task, a 2AFC discrimination on some of these trials. What they were asked was, in addition to matching the orientation, tell me, the Gabor 1 trial ago, was that tilted clockwise or counterclockwise? Just a simple, coarse 2AFC judgment, very, very coarse judgment. Is it tilted that way or that way? an easy task. Subjects are above chance when it's the Gabor that was 1 trial ago. But if it's 2 trials ago or 3 trials ago, subjects are at chance, totally at chance. They have no memory, explicit memory of whether the Gabor 2 or 3 trials ago was tilted that way or that way. And yet we know that their serial dependence was significant even in those specific trials. In fact, Jason went further and looked at the false memory. So subject says that this trial, say a trial 2 trials ago, the Gabor was tilted clockwise. And then he looks at the serial dependence. If they said clockwise and they were wrong, meaning they falsely remembered a clockwise orientation, it turns out that their serial dependence followed what was presented. It follows what was actually there, what they actually saw, not their false memory. So it's not a false memory effect, nor does it require explicit memory. Does it require motor responses? There's been motor serial dependence reported for many years, at least since the 60s, and in fact, before that, well before that, there have been reports of motor serial dependence. So what Jason Fisher did was remove the requirement to make a response, to make a motor response. On 25% of the trials, subjects just watched the display. They didn't make any judgment. They didn't make any kind of matching response. What he found is that to replicate the first experiment, he found that after a response, there was strong serial dependence. When there was no response on the previous trial, there's still serial dependence. So the response itself is not necessary. In other words, the subject can just watch passively the display. The following trial will be pulled toward the passively viewed display. So it doesn't require a motor response. It's not motor serial dependence. But does it require attention? One might think that this kind of serial dependence in perception should depend on attention, or might depend on attention. To answer this question, what Jason Fisher did was a novel experiment of invisibility. Here, what I'm showing you is a dot, a fixation dot, and there are Gabor patches located here, 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 there, and there. Each Gabor patch has a random orientation. They're all super threshold, they're all easily recognizable, and subjects fixated at the center at all the time. They were told to attend, they were cued to attend to one of these randomly on each trial. And only one of them, and they only had to report one of them, so they ignored all the others. Subject would attend to one of these and only have to report that orientation of that Gabor patch. There are a couple of interesting sequences of trials that could happen in this experiment. On the previous trial, subjects might have attended to the same location that they're attending to on this trial. And so a simple question is there serial dependence from this current location, from the previous current, or from the previous location, which is the same? In other words, this is basically a replication of the first experiment. Is there serial dependence from that's at the same retinal location? And there is. This replicates the first experiment pretty well. A more interesting condition is when the previous trial, on the previous trial, subjects attended to a different location. So they attended, say, up here, and on the current trial, they're attending now down here. And the question is there serial dependence from the retinal stimulus, the retinally matching stimulus, to the current stimulus? Is the judgment of orientation here dependent on what was at the retina at the same location? The answer is no, surprisingly. In fact, if anything, there's a negative after effect, a kind of tilt after effect. So what was at the retina previously, if anything, causes a negative after effect, but it does not cause serial dependence. The most interesting case is this. What happens from the previously attended orientation at a different location in space, and is there any serial dependence on the current Gabor orientation? And there is. There's a significant amount of serial dependence that transfers across space, transfers from one location to another location. So this means that a few things. One is serial dependence in perceived orientation can transfer location. It's not retinotopic, and it depends on attention. It's gated by attention, in fact. One has to attend to get serial dependence. If one doesn't attend, then there's no serial dependence. So this attention seems to be very important. And this experiment also suggested that there's some spatial spread. In other words, you can transfer locations. And that prompted Jason Fisher to ask, what is the spatial tuning? To measure the spatial tuning of this serial dependence, Jason had these Gabors jump location. So subject's always fixating, but the Gabor location could jump randomly to any location on the screen, and it's completely random on each trial. And what Jason's interested in is the separation between the Gabors. So Gabor on the previous trial might be separated by that distance. And he measures that distance and he plots it down here. So this is the distance between the sequential Gabors. On the y-axis, what I'll show you is the amplitude of the serial dependence. That's the amplitude of that derivative Gaussian function, the amplitude of the serial dependence effect. It's really strong when the gabors are in the same location, overlapping in sequence. As they're separated further apart, serial dependence gets much weaker, and this function is very broadly tuned. You'll notice that the full width at half max is about 30 degrees, so it's very, very broadly spatially tuned. But it is tuned. It is significantly tuned in space. This is the one-back effect. The two-back effect, the two gabors previously, also produces a serial dependence, but it's much weaker and it's much more narrowly spatially tuned. It's got a full width half max of about 10 degrees. Okay, what this basically is showing is a kind of operator. It's a spatiotemporal operator, and that's what I'm plotting here. In space coordinates, this is the separation between the sequential gabors. 0 means that the two gabors were located at the same location. And further to the periphery means more separation between the sequential gabors. And the heat map shows the degree of serial dependence. So there's very strong serial dependence when objects overlap, and less so when they're separated. But it's very broadly tuned. And this operator for the one-back effect and for the two-back effect shows some temporal tuning as well as spatial tuning. So it's a spatiotemporal operator. And the operator can be visualized in this sort of way, and it looks a lot like, it sort of looks like a spatiotemporal receptive field. We call it a continuity field. It's not a receptive field. A receptive field is a region of the retina or the visual field to which the visual system is responsive. This is a region within which the visual system treats objects as being identical. So it's very different. It's not a region to which the visual system is responsive. It's a region within which two different objects will be treated as if they're identical. So we call this a continuity field. We think it's an important mechanism for promoting perceptual stability. Without it, objects would look different. With it, objects look the same. And we want objects to look the same. We don't want objects to appear to change identity from moment to moment. And if that's true, if I'm right about that, then it should be about objects. It should not just be about features like color or orientation or something like that. We should be able to produce this effect at the level of objects. And that's exactly what Alina Lieberman has been after. Alina's been studying faces in particular. She's looking for serial dependence in face recognition. So when you see sequential faces, usually we don't see twins, like twin sisters very often, but what Alina did was do exactly that. She presented sequences of faces from a morph wheel. She morphed between three identities, identity 1, 2, and 3, and created this continuous morph space of faces that vary in similarity. And now what she does is exactly what Jason Fisher did with the orientation. She presents a random sequence of faces, and every face is totally random. It comes from the wheel of faces, but it's totally random. Some are more similar, and some are very different. On some of the trials, what Alina does is ask the subject to match the face they just saw. They don't have to keep track of anything. There's no memory task. There's no cognitive load here at all. It's just whatever face you just saw, just match it. And what subjects can do is scroll through the whole wheel. They can scroll through the face space and pick the face that they just saw. And Alina does the same thing that Jason did with orientation. When subjects adjust this face to match this face, what she's looking for is whether this face back here, or this face, biases the judgment on this current trial. Does the judgment of this face get pulled by that face? And indeed it does. Here's for reference orientation. I'm showing a Gabor patch there. That's an oriented Gabor patch. This is to represent the orientation serial dependence I showed you in the last set of experiments. That had a serial dependence of over 2 JND, so it's a pretty big serial dependence across a group of subjects. Alina Lieberman finds with faces that there is also serial dependence, and it's about as strong. It's a couple of JNDs. So when you're trying to match this face, when you're trying to perceive this face is pulled by a previous face. It's also pulled by the face before that as well. All right, so faces are serially dependent as well, our perception of faces, but these are just 2D faces, and so Alina asked whether it's really about identity. She wanted to show that it's not just feature level effect, 2D images, that it could be about identity. And so what Alina did was present sequences of faces that varied in orientation. And she was looking for a view invariant serial dependence. So the faces were, just like before, were on the morph wheel, but they were oriented differently. So she had a morph wheel of faces facing rightward and a wheel of faces facing leftward. These are individual people that are not mirror flipped. This is not an image that I've mirror flipped here. What Alina did was took a photograph of somebody from the right half of the face and a photo from the left side of the face. So these are not symmetric. People don't have symmetric faces, and these images are not symmetric either. But they do depict the same individual, and there's no ambiguity that this person is the same as this person over here. All right, and she does the same experiment. She randomly presents faces from either of those morph wheels, and those faces can be from either orientation. And she does the same thing. Subjects are asked to match, take this face, and change it through morph wheel, through face space, to match this face as best they can. And she measures whether this face previously presented holds their judgment at all. And what she finds is that it does. Now what's important here is that the orientation of this face is different than this face, or this face. So she's finding that the serial dependence of this face on this face must come from a view invariant representation. It can't come from the image level features because it wouldn't operate so well, wouldn't operate with that much efficiency otherwise. So there's serial dependence that's operating at a view invariant level. And that does suggest that it's about identities and not just about some image level features like orientation or something like that. And it also means that identity perception for objects, at least as high level as faces, but even maybe other kinds of objects and even perhaps at higher levels of representation are serially dependent. This could be an efficient way for the visual system to classify objects or recognize objects, not have to re-recognize them. If you've already recognized it at 1 second, why bother with re-recognizing everything all over again? It also explains why we don't notice identities changing in movies. So this is a stunt double, this is Brad Pitt, and that's a stunt double. They are sort of similar, but they're not that similar. You see them side by side, it's obvious. When you see them in the movie, nobody notices that this guy is standing in place. This is not because of change blindness. Change blindness is what happens when you fail to attend to something or don't attend to something. These are the stars. These guys are attended full on, and yet nobody notices that it's the same actor at the center of the screen with full attention, and that's because of serial dependence. Serial dependence works because of attention. It's gated by attention, it requires attention. Change blindness requires inattention, it requires not attending to something. So change blindness can be caused not just by inattention, but also by serial dependence, by the continuity field. It happens across objects as high level of faces, but it does require similarity in orientation or similarity in faces. If the faces are too different, then serial dependence does not happen. Okay. So what I've shown you in this third section is, we think, evidence for a novel mechanism we're calling a continuity field, which is a spatial operator that promotes object constancy. We want objects to appear constant in identity, and this produces that effect. We don't want to be too sensitive to changes. The visual system, for 150 years, people have focused on the visual system's sensitivity to changes. Changes in lighting, adapting to motion, adapting to changes in orientation statistics, and that's great. But we don't want to be too sensitive to changes because then everything would change appearance every moment. It would be like we were on psychedelic drugs. And we don't want that most of the time. So this helps maintain a constant stability in object identity perception. It's feature and object selective, not just low-level features, but also these high-level features. It's spatially and temporally tuned, and it requires attention. We think it drives perceptual continuity. So in general, I said across these three sections are very different, but there are three major goals of visual processing. One is filtering distractors, because every scene is cluttered. And second is predicting where things are going. Even if we've isolated it, we need to predict where it's going. And third is maintaining a stable identity representation of that object so that the world doesn't appear to fluctuate. Thank you very much for your time.